Hi everyone, welcome to That Defense Podcast, a podcast where we discuss Indian legal realities. For today's episode, Abhinav Sekhri, a Delhi-based criminal lawyer, joins us, and we are discussing criminal investigations. We try to locate criminal investigations in the larger scope of the Criminal Procedure Code of the country, and we discuss how an investigation agency actually functions. For fans of Vasu, there's a sad news that he could not join us today. However, it still turned out to be a great episode, and we hope you guys enjoy it too. Alright, guys. Hi, welcome to the new episode of That Depends podcast. Today, we are joined by Abhinav, who is a criminal lawyer based out of Delhi. And our topic for today, we're going to discuss a very broad topic, but we'll try to narrow it down as much as we can. So that is investigation. So, hi, Abhinav. And can you just explain what investigation, where does it fit in the larger scheme of things, and what investigation is?
Hi, Rishabh. Hi, Vasu. So it's a bit of a broad one to really tackle, but investigations are, in a way, the heart and soul of the criminal justice system because ultimately, if the larger end game is to have a trial and to have courts adjudicating upon guilt or innocence, investigations are the means by which we ever can arrive at that end. So these are the powers that have been vested in police agencies and even non-police agencies to try and figure out what happened and, to put it technically, to gather evidence in respect of the commission of an offense. And that includes powers that range from the mere sending of notices to the arresting of individuals and obviously recording of statements, etc., etc. So anything that you can imagine that largely is falling under the rubric of powers conferred for purposes of conducting the investigation.
So if you have to like place it in a timeline format, I think it's one thing to think that there's a crime happens or does not happen. So allegedly a crime happens, then usually there's an investigation to figure it out if there's a crime or there's not a crime, and then there's a trial, which we call it after charges are framed, how it's framed. That there's a trial to say that whether the investigation is correct or not. So I think that chronologically, I think that's what I'm trying to say, that's where the investigation really happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what we're trying to say is that then during investigation, because it happens before the trial actually commences, and it's effectively
Yeah.
a fact-finding mission that the investigation agency or police are getting into. So in this
Yeah.
fact-finding mission, the investigation agency has varied competing interests that they have to compare, that they have to actually take care of.
No, so the investigating agency technically has only one interest, which is to find out the truth, so to speak, right? But the investigating agency's interests are singular. But at the same time, the process by which this investigation is happening has to cater to the fact that the investigating agency is just one agent in this process. So you are serving the truth, yes, for the purposes of the ultimate trial, but at the same time you have to do it in a manner that is fair to any suspects that you might encounter, suspects which might then grade up to the level of persons who you accuse, and then there are victims who you have uh, to deal with carefully as well, because they are the ones who have, in a sense, the most direct aggrieved interests out of any other persons. There are also the witnesses that the agency might go ahead and record statements from. So those are another set of people whose interests the agency has to care about. And how that caring exercise is taking place is frankly determined by way of the process spelled out in legislation. So I'd say that you know for looking at that balancing of interests, so to speak, that is something that the legislature thinks of, and then the answers of that balancing exercise are what can be found in various statutes, most predominantly the Criminal Procedure Code, that talks about the process by which investigations ought to be conducted.
So like this, that now this comes from like a ground reality question, that do you think that these interests are actually ever catered to? Because the huge dilemma usually is that the whole fight is that a fair trial is not happening. And what is this fair trial? So for someone, a fair trial, so in a high profile case in which the accused is a high profile person, at that point fair trial is considered to be something in which the investigation agency is hard on the accused. But in, for example, a high profile like Nirbhaya case, fair trial was with the effect that the victims' rights are not being protected. So this whole idea of fair trial, how does the investigation agency do this balancing act within the procedure that's provided to them? I think that's also an important factor.
See, I mean, ultimately, I think there's a bit of a conflation here in the sense that the fair trial, when you speak of it, you are placing and locating yourself within the context of the courtroom. But I agree that the fair trial ought to, and necessarily by implication, includes fairness in the investigation process. So just spelling out that assumption clearly for everyone. So on the question of a fair investigation, the idea is that yes, I mean, ultimately, there is actually only one idea of fairness, which is that you have to follow the law. And there is no other measure here, in the sense that if there are certain benchmarks that are provided for in the statute, and there are certain timelines that you have to adhere to, you have to follow them. And that is the fairness, like, in a strictly legal sense. But obviously, when you are looking at an investigation, one example of fairness, so to speak, is bail hearings, where, for instance, and the exercise of the powers that are being conferred upon you. So while there are all of these powers that the police has, a lot of these are obviously discretionary, in the sense of, again, using arrest as an example. When do you decide that you need to arrest the individual, right? So do you only do it to make sure that that person doesn't run away? Do you do it to ensure that that person doesn't threaten the victim or the witness? Or do you do it to send a message? All of these are different reasons, right? But ultimately, the accused might turn around and say that, how is it fair to have me in custody when there is no threat of me doing number one or number two?
Yeah.
Because again, philosophically, legally speaking, you can't be using me to send a message to society, right?
Yeah.
I am not an instrumental element. This is again slightly philosophical in a way, but frankly, it's also true in law, where one person can't be treated as an instrumentality for you to achieve other systemic goals. So there is that issue that crops up in arrest and bail, where bail is often denied largely for no other reason but this issue of that message being sent out that grave crimes ought to be treated differently.
And I think you discussed this in some of your writings that I read, which is also true, that now economic offenses are considered grave offenses. So if these economic offenses are grave offenses, that's the sole ground for the investigation agency to act a certain way. And then that's the new procedure. So for example, under PMLA or money laundering or like UAPA, the process and the idea of fairness in investigation has changed. So I think what we feel, or what I felt initially, was that the criminal procedure code provides a certain idea of fairness. And that fairness is the process of law. But that process of law at some point was realized to be too fair, or it was considered to be too slow. And then the special laws came into being, which had a different process. And then with that different process, there's a different idea of what fairness is. But is it really fairness? Because it makes a departure from what we understand as fairness to be.
So, I mean, again, what do we understand fairness to be is a bit here and there. But I agree that, it is definitely contextual, because like you rightly identify, the same standards are not found across the board. So even within the CRPC, different standards apply, let's say, to a case that is punishable with death and a case that is not. So similarly, that is what is being seen across the board when it comes to investigations under PMLA, etc. And you're absolutely right insofar as different kinds of powers are being conferred. And to take this example further, I mean, one famous historical example of this is obviously terror laws such as the TADA and the POTA.
Yeah.
And even currently the MACOCA, as it is called, the Maharashtra Control of Organized Crimes Act, where all of these statutes confer the power to record statements that are later on admissible, even confessional statements that are admissible, which is a huge departure from the traditional scheme of things. And yeah, ultimately there is at some level an assessment being made by Parliament that, look, that is not good enough. That ordinary procedure is not good enough. And so we need that departure to safeguard interests of society.
Yeah.
So is that, I don't know, like ultimately, is that fairness or not?
Yeah, that's
it's a really difficult one to answer, because what is is it a fairness assessment that is leading to the current general procedure? And I think that is a contested assumption to make,
Yeah.
because especially when it comes to India and a lot of our legal standards, a lot of them are just there because of inertia rather than any prevailing notion of fairness or justice. So
Yeah.
it's a bit difficult to assume that fairness is the driving logic there. But I mean, there's definitely the recognition that the general is not good enough for
Yeah.
a growing majority of crime, not a minority anymore. But slowly, more and more exceptional categories are getting recognized, where exceptional measures are being permitted.
And I think that change in thinking of people at large is because I think lawyers understand crime to be committed differently from people at large. Like that's it's a bit snobbish to say, but I feel that for us it's crime. For a crime to happen, there are certain ingredients that have to be fulfilled. And if those are not fulfilled, it is considered a if it's not that crime. So that's a very simple idea. For example, if A, B, and C happens, it is, for example, fraud. But if C doesn't happen, only A and B happens, it's not fraud. But that idea of what a crime is very difficult to prove, and that's what investigation has to do in the so by coming back to what the investigation agency is doing, they're trying to establish if these ingredients are fulfilled or not, and that's a long process by the end of the day. And
Yeah.
that delay in the process is being considered too much, and that is now being, I think, confused with the rights of the accused, and that's where there's the whole idea that it should go away. So I think what we also want to understand is what is the investigation agency trying to prove in the investigation? What is it looking at?
Uh, I'll take your analogy only forward and use a rather literary sort of way to explain this.
Yeah.
See, the language of ordinary people and the language of law might be different, and it is the job of the investigating agency to act as a translation agent. Basically, they are the ones who are going to transform, and it is really a transformative act that they're engaging in, transform the narrative that they get from a victim or a witness, and then place it and locate it within the confines of the law. So for instance, let's say if you go to a police station saying that someone stole something from me, it is the police officer who will then have to figure out where that is located within the law, in the sense of, okay, did that happen from inside your house? Did that happen from outside your house? Did you already give it to that person and that person ran away with it? Did that person take it without your permission? The answers to all of these questions will result in application of different provisions in law as far as the description of the crime itself is concerned. So that transformative act is what the police are really responsible for in the process, because ultimately it's the court can't locate itself there in the open to gather the facts to make that narrative a narrative that the law will recognize. And so that largely is one way to think about an investigation. You're right that it takes time, but ultimately, again, to offer some pushback on this idea that that's why there are some who are recognizing that the rights of the accused ought to be taken away. It's not that it's just because of the issue of time that the rights of the accused. We have to also understand what rights do accused persons necessarily have in the investigative process to begin with, as far as India is concerned. And the answer, frankly, is that like, not much, right? Because for 2-3 reasons. One is obviously that the Code of Criminal Procedure 1973 traces its origins back to the 19th century codes, at a time when this notion of the accused person having rights, etc., was not really too well founded. Apart from the fact that there was a core right that you recognized, which was the right to personal liberty in theory, in a way.
Yeah.
And so any deprivations of that required, carving out specifically in statute. So the investigation was not really seen as the site of that. The trial was seen as the site of that. Slowly, what has happened is, because actually trials take as long as they do, and the investigations are, the front and center and the attention-seeking mechanism, so to speak, that's where the action happens, and that's where the focus also goes. So, which is why the focus on the rights at the investigative stage has grown a lot over time,
Yeah.
as opposed to the rights during trial, which is where historically most of the fights had been.
Yeah.
So today, what we're seeing is that limited notion of rights. So what rights does an accused have traditionally in the investigation? A right to representation,
Yeah.
a right to legal assistance, a right of obviously not being arrested without reason, or if you want to go ahead and expand that, a right to prompt bail, and a right not to be coerced into giving testimony. So the so-called right against compelled self-incrimination.
Yeah.
Half of these are extremely qualified as is in India. So, for instance, from practical experience, I can tell you that the right to a lawyer during an investigation is not recognized in statute, which
Yeah.
is why it's one of the most, like one of the sadder things to tell people, that the police aren't really doing anything illegal by not having me inside the room, because frankly, there's no legal requirement for them to do so.
Yeah.
So, there's actually not too much left there to begin with for the new processes to truncate.
Mm.
With what has happened is that the new processes largely have truncated two things. One is obviously your right of bail,
Yeah.
which is what they attack most vigorously. And the other thing that the other processes attack is this the statements angle about whether or not your confessions are admissible in evidence.
Yeah.
But apart from that, there's not much that the new processes have to take away to begin with, if you get what I mean.
Sorry, I think it's just circling back a bit. That very interesting thing, because at one part, the investigation agency has this duty to translate a crime, a happening of a crime, into law. That's one part. And for that, they will do it because that's their job by the end of it. But on the other hand, the accused, like you rightly explained, does not have a lot of rights. So maybe he has a counterfactual narration to what has happened, and he wants to plead certain. So these are two things. Was one is the investigation agency actually trained enough to convert a factual narration by a victim into law, and do they do it rightly? Because that's one part. And the second part is because the rights of the accused are so limited by the end of it. How does the accused ensure that their rights also come into this narration of facts? Because right now what I'm trying to understand is the investigation agency has a huge role, and that the role that they fulfill will actually define everything that will happen in the trial, will lead to conviction or not. So are they even doing this, and how is this happening then?
I mean, you are absolutely right in your assessment about the importance of their role, and they are trained. As in, technically speaking, the officers who are conducting investigations, they have necessary courses and necessary training in law. The police manuals that govern their actions are also necessarily spelling out, the requirement to do it in a certain way that safeguards these interests. And as to your specific questions about, the accused has a version, frankly, the accused is there for questioning. And when the accused offers a version, it is incumbent upon the police officer to investigate all facts.
Yeah.
Right. So obviously what we find is happening, like more often than not, at least if we believe the accused's version, is that often those allegations are not met fully. So the difficulty is then, what does an accused do? The accused then approaches remedies, we find quashing petitions, etc., etc. But let's please understand that those are actually a very minuscule component of the larger, story of litigation.
Yeah.
It's front and center because it happens in appellate courts, the High Court and the Supreme Court, and gets a lot of traction. But the bread and butter is not a quashing petition. The bread and butter is an actual investigation. And where if you look at NCRB data, it's not that all investigations are ending in charge sheets only. So the NCRB's data shows that not an insignificant number, but it's not 0.1% also. It's at least in double digits that cases are not closing in charge sheets. They are being closed either as false cases or for want of evidence.
Yeah.
So at least at some level, yes, that exercise is happening. Now, is that exercise happening robustly enough? Are they trained well enough to be able to, fully discharge their responsibilities in that transformative exercise, as we put it? I mean, again, it's an assessment question. If you were to speak to someone who is on the side of the prosecution, the answer might be different. If you speak to someone on the side of the defense, the answer might be different. I usually sit on the side of the defense, and usually my answer is that no, it's not always very sufficient.
Yeah.
But again, it's an assessment question. So ultimately, I think that in my assessment from my limited experience, often we do find that either those those versions of the accused are not sufficiently explored, because well, that might not lead to a charge sheet.
One thing is, are there enough? There is no incentive for someone to do that. Like, that's a very crass way to put it. But what are the incentive that investigation agency has? So they have a job to do. Their job can be really complicated and it's really hard to investigate. But they can take a path of least resistance and try to do it. Like do the bare minimum to ensure something happens. And I think this leads to another factor, that the rate of conviction, or the how many charge sheets that are finally filed lead to conviction, that is also not that high. I think it's lesser than 50%. I might be wrong here, but so that's also a thing. What are the incentives that the investigation agency has during investigation? And even if they file a charge sheet, it's not that it will lead to a conviction. So that's also a huge problem there.
So just on your point of least resistance, frankly, that is also found, and more often found, in not registering FIRs altogether, right? So that is where you find your path of least resistance. You just don't register the case to begin with. Because investigations are complicated, involve a lot of paperwork, and it's in nobody's interests to actually carry out that task. But as far as the other thing is concerned, you're absolutely right that the charge sheet is the easiest way to do it. Because ultimately, I would put it the other way as well. It's not about least resistance. It's also about deviating from the norm. See, ultimately, if I file a charge sheet, I have to answer lesser questions than if I file a closure report. If I put myself in the shoes of a police officer. Because if I file a charge sheet, that case will normally go ahead to trial, and the accused person will have his or her rights in statute clearly there at the certain subsequent stage where the prosecutor will deal with it. If I file a closure, I have to explain that closure much more, to a degree that is much higher than the degree to which I have to explain why I filed a charge sheet. So you're right. I would agree with you in the sense that normally nobody has any incentive to deviate from the norm. Especially when you know that, boss, I can kick the ball further and someone else exists further down the line to pick up that baton, to pick up that ball and deal with it. If I file a closure, I have dealt with it. Right. And tomorrow then I will have to face the consequences of having made that decision.
The classic line is, sir, court se karwa lena. Like, why are you troubling my...
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And you're right. And frankly, they're not wrong in the sense that it is the court's job. But the issue is that if everyone was applying their mind to the level at which they were, then that would also reduce the burden that is on courts. Because, and this is something that impacts things in a systemic way as well, where if you look at, if you look at the larger statistic about pending cases, investigations end up, like you said, around 85-90% of investigations end up in charge sheets. Courts are not able to finish more than 30% of their work any given year. I mean, 30 is also being charitable. And so that just keeps ballooning the rate of pendency. And like you said, ultimately, it's not that 85% cases are ending in convictions. Half of them are actually bogus cases, because either the evidence is not good enough or it's just not an offense made out in law. So if that screening exercise was happening in a more robust fashion, then maybe we would also be dealing with a significantly less number of pending cases. So it's not only about, it has a larger implication. So that's just something that is worthwhile to flag.
Also, then I think you've also written about it previously, that because now what we are seeing is not something out of the world. Like, we are just discussing what's happening. So that's a general perception also, that there might be a case that the police officer might not be doing his job correctly, or there is no incentive. So this leads to the court monitoring investigations, or people now relying upon the courts to come and monitor investigations or do investigations. And that happens across range. So that can happen in a trial. For example, in a trial court, you can move a certain application, or you can go, in high profile cases, you come straight to the High Court or the Supreme Court and try to file a writ petition, then try to influence the investigation in a certain way. And do you think that's the solution, or do you think that's actually leading to a problem by the end?
See, again, so here is where the stakeholder perspective becomes important to consider, because what you find is it might be something that makes all the stakeholders more, it's also a trust issue. right? So if you don't trust the cops, if you don't trust the people who are ordinarily charged with an investigation, you might vest greater trust as both accused and victims in the exercise being monitored by a third person, an arbiter as such. Now, obviously, that can't happen in every case. So what you find is, and there is actually no statistical evidence as such to show whether the quality of investigations is better or worse. It's just that the visibility ends up, if you know that someone is watching your every move every 2 weeks, then you might act in a very different way as opposed to, you just having a free reign till the deadline day and then figuring out everything and filing your papers.
Yeah.
So ultimately, then, frankly, the courts also can't do it in every case. Then that means that some cases are being privileged over others. Is that fair, really? There are, like, seriously, because ultimately, just because it is a high profile case, does that mean that a non high profile case ought to be treated differently with a lesser quality of an investigation? It's a serious question, because ultimately
Yeah.
that's what ends up happening. And to give you my current favorite example, look at what's happening in respect to the Unitech case in the Supreme Court, where frankly every 2 weeks there is a hearing that is going on where documents are being shared in sealed covers. The accused persons have been as under trials in custody for over 3.5 or 4 odd years. What's stopping the trial from just concluding? Just go ahead, like, hold, pass orders expediting the trial, ask that to be concluded on a day-to-day basis, and just get that. Ultimately, by not doing that, by scrutinizing every minute detail of the investigation, that ends up complicating the hands of the agencies, that ends up complicating the rights of the accused, and that also then skews the system overall, because ultimately, you know th- there are some cases that are getting this high profile treatment as well, given the kind of offender or the kind of stakes involved. But ultimately, the system is all the more poorer for it, because you are in a way sending a message that this can't be happening in the regular case, that this quality that we are giving you is reserved for the creme de la creme.
Yeah.
And that's really, in a way, then what's really the point for both, for all sets of persons?
Yeah. And I think another
Because
issue is that now, what I find very weird is that now you see, maybe there's more visibility to it, but now you see writ petitions asking for a CBI investigation. So
yeah, it's
what gives me a right to ask for a CBI investigation, except the fact that my
yeah,
crime is being highlighted among everyone? And so
no,
effectively,
exactly, right. And there is no jurisprudence behind it either. And if you were to in like go into this issue of what merits a transfer, etc., it's all very, I know it when I see it. Like, there is no real standard as such that you can really put your finger onto.
yeah, is it,
And
but then basically who can afford the lawyer to argue this in court? That's the standard.
yeah, and how far high can you go? So if you don't win with the High Court, then do you have the resources and the ability to go to the Supreme Court, etc., etc.? So that really is about it.
Yeah, but do you think these investigation agencies that we supposedly have more trust on, the CBI, or I think I'm again saying that you've written on it because because about these other independent agencies, so-called, so the NIA for that matter, these agencies that are formed under a special act. Do you think this is a solution? Because an ordinary investigation agency, which is usually in the traditional sense the cops or the police, as we call it, the state police, is not considered a good version, or they do not do a good investigation. So then there are these agencies under these acts. So is that a solution? So like what we're trying to figure out, that there are various things that the legislature does which actually is not the solution, but they try to pitch it as the solution. Do you think that works?
See how, and I think there's a good theoretical example of this. And there is some writing by this author called Nasir Hussain, who has written on the idea of emergencies, but also otherwise. What's interesting is how many exceptions do you create, right? So do you want a specialized agency for every small other thing? And ultimately, then what happens is that these specialized agencies are not the agencies that are going to be dealing with persons on a day-to-day basis. And again, that can't and is not, can never be the answer, because ultimately the legitimacy of your criminal justice system is not upheld by having these special agencies. It's by having a police force that is responsive and that has the trust of the ordinary people. Because why does anyone turn to the criminal justice system? right? In the ideal normal world, it is to, because that is the answer that you have when you are faced with a problem that, seriously affects your right to life or personal liberty, or your, or derivative rights as such as individuals. Like there's a massive theft in your house. What do? You can't really, like, find the culprit. You don't know who the culprit is. You need that arm of the state. And there is also a level of trust that you have in that arm of the state to do the job. If that is not there, it's really, there really is no point, because slowly then that corrosion extends. So for instance, if you were to look at the public perception, the CBI is now back and has always been, that there's that like line about caged parrots and whatnot.
Yeah.
There are corruption allegations that have been leveled against officers in all of these agencies, the CBI and the ED combined. Today, the NIA is also viewed at with suspicion because of the implications of the central government versus the state government. So there is suspicion all around. It's not that, like, and frankly, it's not that the conviction rates of any of these agencies is very high as opposed to the other.
Yeah.
So for instance, if you were to look at the only reason why there is a higher conviction rate in a lot of the NCRB data on special laws is a lot of those are offenses that are, like, crystal, in the sense of an arms act offense or a liquor offense, where if you are found in possession of that contraband, that's proven.
Yeah.
But when it comes to building a case, it's not that either the CBI or the ED or the NIA have a track record that is showing you that, oh look, we are getting convictions, we are building cases that are trustworthy.
Yeah.
So ultimately, on 2 points, then it's not really ever going to sustain as an answer. One is, the more exceptions you create, the more actually you drive a wedge in what is the ordinariness of crime, which is what normal people need from the criminal justice system, which is the answer. Because all of these cases that these agencies are dealing with, the CBI, the ED, or the NIA, these are real, like, they are, to give you an example, the amount of attention that a UAPA case generates in terms of the media is extremely disproportionate to its total number, the total number of UAPA cases in the system, right?
Yeah.
There are at like 2,000 odd prosecutions that are there. That's all. You have 2.5 crore cases that are pending. So, and that's not a marker on we shouldn't talk about these cases. We should, but ultimately that's not what is going to define how the criminal justice system works.
Yeah.
And if you're talking about, like, lifting the barometer on the minimums, then you can't be hoping to do that by again and again going to a special agency.
Yeah. So the solution, so usually we try to avoid this question, but do you think that there is a solution with respect to how can we build this trust back, and like what, because by the end of it, it's a systematic problem that needs a complete overhaul that we need in the system. But is there, on the top of your head, something that the state might do to build the trust of the individuals and accept what they are doing right now?
I mean, so there is a fair bit of literature on policing as a concept. So I think started with investigations, but we're ending with policing.
Yeah.
But investigations are a subset of what policing is all about, right? Policing is about having an officer who has a presence. How many of us knows or have regular police officers that are, maintaining a presence? We don't have that many police officers to begin with. Let's be very clear.
Yeah.
So, but policing investigation is a subset where you have persons who you trust in the form of a policing agent, who then is who you turn to when, that kind of bad thing happens.
Yeah.
So unless you start with that, there is no hope for you to then just assume that, when the worst thing happens, these agents are going to turn up and deliver. So no, I mean, it's way beyond ordinary comprehension.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
the budgetary constraints that are there. So you can just hope that what you have already, you start by improving what you have, which is that if you have an agency that is bringing in charge sheets on the house, 85%, and 50% or less of them are ending in convictions, then the first place to start would obviously be to have greater scrutiny of the quality of the output, right?
Yeah.
So that would be a good place to start, because ultimately, if you realize that what is building trust in the system, is it the charge sheet or is it the conviction? And that's actually a very important question that we don't answer anymore. Because if frankly the charge sheet is what is building trust in the system, then so what if it's a bogus charge sheet? No one's waiting around to figure out whether there is a conviction or not, right?
Exactly.
And if we are only in the perception game, and that's what a post-truth world seems to be teaching all of us, is that perception matters a lot more than facts, then should the police not just be investing as much time and energy in the perception game? And
Yeah, because if the facing
because often
trial is in itself,
yeah, exactly.
So that's facing trial is the punishment. People are happy with respect to you being under trial for 5 years, and that's
so nobody cares about the trial. So maybe we need to be, we need to change our thinking. It's we who are at fault. It's not the system. The system is actually working fine.
Yeah.
It is our old-fashioned way of thinking that needs to be automatically changed.
Yeah, and I think another interesting thing we do, like our time is running out, but another one like interesting thing I feel is that this investigation and lack of trust on investigation agencies by the public and also by the court also leads to a bypass of the criminal procedure, because then you start making social doctrines on the top of your head to ensure that at least one person gets a fair investigation, but that just leads to more confusion and not solution.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, so I think it's that. I think that's the thing. It's what I think in our earlier episode of bails also we ended up at this conclusion that what's the goal? What if the goal is to send a message, then the goal is being fulfilled. Because if sending a message ensures there's less crime, it's doing what it has to do. You don't need you don't need a conviction. You just need to file a charge sheet. So
that's what.
Yeah. So the how we understand is actually different. So either you change the perception at large or you change your perception.
Correct.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Thank you, Abhinav. Thank you for this. Thank you for joining us and thank you for being part of this podcast. We were really happy to have you on.
No, my pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you all.